Introduction. Tonight's speaker, Jim Benn, was always going to be an engineer. His father, grandfather were engineers, and Meccano was always his favourite toy. We spoke about that just earlier. That was certainly my favourite toy when I grew up. Growing up. In 1951, the family moved to Farnborough, and aviation ended his soul. He became a craft apprentice at the RAE, actually NGTE, and stayed in the civil service all his career. Apart from a hiatus at the Department of Industry for 6 years, all of that time was spent in the MOD and its predecessors. He finished his career as a resident project officer at BAE Systems Brough. He became a member of the MIMechE in '74 and has recently joined the RAE, the Aeronautical Society, as a member. He has retained his passion for aviation through his retirement, and was well qualified to give the lecture today.
And I should explain that.
So our speaker tonight, Jim, and changing an aircraft.
Thank you. Well, I think all of you will realise that we're going to be talking about modifications tonight, and that would be a very dry subject, and you might all go home. But I'm able to illustrate it with some nice stories of modifications, some of which went well, some of which went badly, and one of which was absolutely horrifying. So, when I started thinking about this lecture, my first thought was Rudyard Kipling. As true, as far as I'm concerned, then, as it is now. And why do you change an aircraft? What do you change? When do you change it? Where do you change it? Who changes it? And most importantly of the lot, how do you change an aircraft? Right, I've got to start with two caveats. My experience has been on British aircraft, not multinational aircraft. You find on multinational aircraft that the procedures for modifications tend to be modified to suit the needs of the 3 countries or 4 countries or however. The second thing I've got to say is that these are the arrangements that were in existence when I retired, which is 20 odd years ago, although I will go into the current situation as well. So, first of all, 2 whys. Why am I qualified to talk to you, and why modify an aircraft? As Darren has just said, I was the resident project officer. Now, some of you will know what a resident technical officer, an RTO, is. An RPO was exactly the same thing with a different name. And I was the RTO at BAE Systems Brough. Now, the primary role of the RTO is to ensure that the company is competent to maintain its design approval. And I need to start my first story with a history of design approval. Because in the First World War, there were lots of companies making aeroplanes to fight with. The RAF, in the form of the Royal Aircraft Factory, was making aircraft. But then other companies like Avro and Martinsyde and all the others were making aircraft. There was an organisation set up to make sure that they made the aircraft properly, and that organisation is called AID, Aircraft Inspection Department. That was started during the First World War and in different forms continues to this day. However, in terms of design, it was very different, because the MOD, or its predecessor, was very unhappy about these people designing aeroplanes, so they insisted that every drawing of every part of every aeroplane was sent back to the Royal Aircraft Factory at Farnborough to be checked and approved. Now you realise this is a very unwieldy system. You can imagine trains rushing about all over England from Manchester down to Farnborough and back, taking all these drawings. So in 1928, the MOD, again, or its predecessor, I shall we call it Ministry of Planes? The Ministry of Planes introduced the concept of a design-approved firm. It became the design-approved organisation. which is more appropriate today. And that means that if you want to design an aeroplane, or a bit of an aeroplane, what you have to do is you have to first ask the MOD, Ministry of Planes, to assess your company and make sure your design is competent and your design procedures are competent as well. Indeed, one of the very last things I did as an RTO was do a design approval of BAE Systems itself, along with a lot of my colleagues. An important thing was for bigger companies, a person was put into the company to make sure that the design approval that they'd obtained was maintained. And that was my job. It was a very important job, but it was not very time consuming, particularly working with a company like BAE Systems, who are a very competent organisation. So I was given the job of modifications, and that's why I'm here tonight. So, I know a bit about modifications and modification procedure. So, why do we modify an aircraft? Well, to make it better. It doesn't work like that, sadly. Because the government, as you all know, is very good at spending vast sums of money on grandiose schemes that they then cancel. There's a TSR2 over the way, and there's the the Nimrod MRAe4, sorry, which was cancelled after it was flying. And even today, you've only got to look at the northern leg of HS2, and we're still doing it. So there's never any money left. So if you want to produce an improvement to an aircraft like my aircraft, which was the Hawk, there was no money. However, there is a need to correct a fault in an aircraft, and that's where most of the modifications come from, and to replace worn-out components, where there isn't a like-for-like replacement, because that would be just a change. So what do you modify? Well, you modify the aircraft, of course, but it's much, much more complicated than that. Because as well as design approval, there's a concept called design authority. They're different. These days, it's not called design authority, it's called design organisation. I'm not sure that's any better, but it's changed. When a company decides to build an aircraft, they first of all produce lots of drawings and calculations and graphs and technical information, and that mass of stuff makes the company the design authority. Now, a design authority can be moved and it can be sold. In the case of the Phantom, we had a sister design authority. There was McDonnell Douglas and BAE Systems Brough that were both sister design authorities. In the case of the Hawk, the design authority, which was at Kingston, was moved up to Brough, and it gave me the job because we needed more people at Brough, and therefore I got to get my job. Next thing is, when do you modify an aircraft? Well, the first question I should ask is, when do you start modifying an aircraft? I remember that the Jaguar, which I had a little to do with, used to have a concept of alterations before modifications. And I've always thought that the time when modification should start is the final conference. A big meeting that the RAF and the MOD have to make sure that the aircraft that they've got is what they want. Because it seems to me that before then, it's the company's responsibility to put things right. And after then, it's not just the company, it's the company and the MOD at the same time. The question of when you modify an aircraft is determined by its classification. Classification is just a number. It can be D4, which is not very urgent, or it can be A1, which is oh my god, ground the aircraft. And you get various differences there. The letter refers to aircraft in build, the number refers to the aircraft in the RAF, and you can have B3 and things like that. You can get situations like that. The next question is a lot easier. Where do you modify the aircraft? Mostly the RAF do it themselves, often down at St Athan, where Darren worked. Occasionally you'll get aircraft put to return to works, and therefore you'll get a modification or a set of modifications which improve the aircraft. The Buccaneer went through a return to works programme, and I shall talk about that later on. Who modifies the aircraft? Again, the RAF do the work, but if the aircraft is in production as well as in service, which you'll get halfway through a project, you get a situation where some of the aircraft are modified, embodied, could I use all these funny words that they like, in build and by the RAF. And last but by no means least, I need to talk about how do you produce modification. And before I answer that question, I need to go back to modifications and changes. Because not all modifications are modifications. There's a thing called STI, a special technical instruction. If you find that somebody's left a washer off a bolt, you might have to undo the nut, put the washer on, put that back. You don't need a modification for that. So you can do that by an STI. And also, the RAF have the authority to design and manufacture and embody their own modifications. They call them CEMs, Service Engineered Modifications. However, and this is important, all changes must result, or should result, in a modification. Because of this concept of design authority, because you need to keep the drawing set up to date with the aircraft. Give you an example, and I've chosen for this the Hawk new wing. You all know that the Hawk was a very successful aircraft. It still is a very successful aircraft all over the world. But ours were using up their wing life, and they needed a new wing. It wasn't just a new wing, it was a better wing, better structurally and better in terms of aerodynamics and all sorts of other things. So it needed to be a modification. There were a lot of discussions between the company and MOD, and there was even a contract between the two. However, without a modification, none of the aircraft could fly with a new wing. And that modification was Mod 999. I shall go on to that. Now there's rules. Nothing happens without rules. In the case of modifications, the rule is a defence standard. DEFSTAN 05123. I wish I had my copy. When I moved from my old town of Goole, I threw my copy away. I really, really regret that. There's a new one, and I've got it here. DEFSTAN 05057. And I'll come to that right at the end. Right. It was a significant change, and there were discussions. However, for that modification, and for every modification, there's a two-stage process. A costed technical proposal, you'll understand that, it's called a Form 714, is presented to a meeting which I chaired at Brough called the Local Technical Committee. And that Local Technical Committee considered all the modification proposals put forward by BAE, either on their own volition or more likely at the request of the RAF, and we considered them and agreed to take them forward. And it was presented on a pro forma. You wouldn't be surprised about that now, would you? And that is a Form 714. I'll give you a few minutes to look at that. It's quite complicated. If you're really interested, I've got a copy here, so I won't spend too long. But if you're really interested, come and see me afterwards and we'll go through it in detail. It's a double-sided document, and on the back is the effects on. You'll see there are quite a lot of effects on, and they're important. So, what happens next? If the LTC agrees with the proposal, the Form 714 is signed by the RTO and goes forward to the next stage. Now that seemed to me always odd. I worked for MOD and I was signing this form on behalf of the company. And I think that made me an agent of BAE Systems in contractual terms. I certainly always considered that I was an advocate of that modification for the rest of this journey. The purpose of the LTC was to convince me that the modification was worthwhile, so that at the next stage, I, on behalf of both MOD and company, could take it forward. That taking it forward was to a meeting held in London, it moved subsequently, called the Aircraft Modifications Committee. And if that modification was approved there, it became an amendment to a contract that the MOD and BAE had set up. It was chaired by a senior MOD official, group captain rank, and he had to be a chartered engineer, as I am. And if he accepted the mod, a contract had been placed. And the Form 714 turned into a Form 715. Looks exactly the same, it's just that you've got to look at the box where it says forwarded or approval. Unfortunately, due to the courtesy of my good friends at BAE Systems, there's the actual Form 714 for the Hawk New Wing, Mod 999. As I say, I've got that in my bag, and if you're interested, I'll show you that as well. There's lots of pages of it. I'm not going to go through it now, because you'd find it a bit boring. Now, you get to trial installation. For lots and lots of modifications, all the medium and big size ones, you need to make sure on an aircraft that the modification will work. So you have a thing called a trial installation, TI, and that would be a submission to my LTC up to the AMC for the modification, and that would be fitted to one aircraft, and that would then be flown, checked, approved, and if everybody was happy, we'd have a meeting when the RAF said that it all fits and works, and it was known as a 555 conference, because far back in the mists of time there used to be a Form 555. I haven't got a copy of it, but there was. And the last bit of that is the contractor would procure, they do love their lovely words, don't they? Procure modification kits, and it would be embodied, and there would be a leaflet, instructions on how to fit the mod. It would first of all become a draft modification leaflet, and lots of people have heard of a DML, and then a modification leaflet. The old drawing set would be then modified, changed, to reflect the modification. And that change is called design incorporation. The RAF would embody the modification. The Form 700 for that aircraft would note that it was post-Mod 999 It could not have got a new wing or whatever, and away we go. And hopefully they will be fleet embodied. They weren't always. Now, I talked about STIs and CEMs. You still need those in the drawing set. So there was a concept of a cover modification. A cover modification is where there aren't any mod sets, that nothing gets embodied because it already has, but you still need to incorporate it into the drawing set. So a 714 was presented, which only covered the cost of design incorporation, and it went through again this exact same process. Right. Configuration control, configuration management. Have you all heard of configuration management? It's very, very important. Now there are lots and lots of definitions of configuration control or configuration management, but I like to think of it as keeping all the aircraft in the fleet the same, or at least knowing what the differences between them are. The other good definition is knowing what you've got. It may seem boring, but it matters. And I'm going to tell you a story now. One day, there was a Jaguar flying along on a transit from somewhere to somewhere else, very high up, because that's where the engine works best, on a cruise climb. And one of the engines made horrible noises and stopped. Now, this was not good news, but a Jaguar's got two, so it wasn't a disaster. So he flew on his remaining engine to the nearest convenient aerodrome, landed, and they took the engine to pieces. I learned this from a good colleague of mine, Richard Durnford, who was the RTO at Rolls-Royce. They found that the oil pump wasn't scavenging properly at altitude. So they introduced an STI, or the engine equivalent of an STI, to bore out one of the oil ways in the oil pump so that it scavenged better. But they only did it on Hawk oil pumps. Different engine, of course. The other thing they didn't do was change the part number. Perhaps you can guess the rest. A Hawk was flying from Finland back to England at altitude. It had got a Jaguar oil pump without the STI on it. It made horrible noises and stopped. Now, at that time, we were desperately trying to introduce a modification to fit GPS to the Hawk. And every time we got partway through it, what would happen is that they changed the GPS unit and we had to start again. However, the pilot was carrying a GPS unit and some batteries in his pocket. So he went clunk, nearest aerodrome, because he was gliding at that time, of course. We had a lecture at Brough from that pilot. He called prepare eject on 4 separate occasions on the approach. It was a streaming wet day. He landed it and stopped it 50 feet from a cliff. All because they didn't change the part number. Configuration management. Right. Since I retired, RTOs have disappeared, and I think that is bad news. My job was working at the company, and because of that, I had the ear of the company. They would tell me things that they wouldn't tell the rest of the MOD. Now, I knew who I worked for, and if I thought it was important enough, I would tell my bosses in MOD what was going on. And that was my professional responsibility to know when I could talk and when I couldn't. So I thought the RTO had a very, very valuable job to do, and they don't exist anymore. The other thing is that DEFSTAN 05123, which was called Technical Procedures for the Procurement of Aircraft, Weapons and Electronic Systems, is now called configuration management of defence material. Don't wait for the film. So I've got a copy here and I've read it. Damned hard work it was too. Firstly, it's tri-service. It covers the Navy and the Air Force and the Army. It concentrates on configuration management, which I think is a good thing. Heard why. Design authority, which we all understood, even if it wasn't the best term, has now become design organisation, which isn't the same thing at all. The Form 714, which you've just seen, has been replaced by a modification proposal form, and it's vastly more complicated. That form that I showed you just a few minutes ago, there were 23 effects on. On the new form, there's 77. One of those effects on is discrimination. It says, state if there is effect on the ability to discriminate between objects and actions. Now, if any of you can understand that, you're a better man than me. Because I don't understand it, and I never could. On the positive side, it sorted out the silliness of me signing the modification proposal form. It's now signed by the company. But I'm very worried because I couldn't find anywhere where it was a two-stage process. And I'm very concerned that modifications could be introduced on the say-so of one meeting. And I think that would be a bad thing. Right, I'm coming to the end now. But it's quite a long end. I'll tell you about two modifications. One that went horribly wrong and one that went very, very well indeed. I've got a third if you really, really want it. Mod 980 was a centralised brake reservoir. On the Hawk, the foot motors are topped up on the rudder pedals. And that means that a fitter has got to climb upside down in the cockpit with a ridge bridger gun to top them up every so often. So it was decided before I started to have a centralised brake reservoir, a bit like on a car. We have a reservoir in the cockpit and pipes down to the foot motors. Everything that could go wrong with that modification did. The pipes were too large in diameter and too stiff, so they cracked. And when they cracked, they squirted hydraulic oil all over the cockpit. We said that's no good, and BAE introduced some new smaller pipes. And we went to RAF Valley to have one of these Form 555 meetings. Not everybody turned up. The pipes didn't turn up. And would you believe in North Wales that day there was an earthquake? We went on and on and on with the modification. Eventually I got it to the point of offering it to this AMC for classification, and it was thrown out. I was sorry, but I could see the justification. I think it was a rogue modification. Better news, Buccaneer Mod 1812. The Buccaneer Mark II didn't meet its specification for cooling the equipment in the equipment bay. But because there wasn't very much equipment in the equipment bay in the early versions of the Buccaneer, nobody knew, including the company and the RAF. Then they took the Buccaneers to, I think it was Woodford, and did a major modification programme to put a lot more equipment in, including an IN, inertial navigation system. And then the problems started. The IN used to overheat. I had to go down to a meeting in London. This was when I first started as a deputy RTO, which was called the CATWAP. Can't remember what it stands for, I wish I could. certainly working parties in there someone, and contractor probably. And the RAF complained bitterly that the equipment was overheating, and BAE did something that I came to find that BAE did very, very well. They would say, nothing's wrong, nothing's wrong, nothing's wrong. Oh yes, something's wrong and we fixed it. And that's what they did. They inserted a little fan in the ducting between the engines and the equipment bay, and then the RAF said, well, if you're going to put a fan in, could we have a bigger one? Because BAE was going to take liability, except they were only going to take liability for a little fan, not a big one. So there was much, much more. Anyway, we eventually introduced the bigger fan and called it Mod 1812. And the last point of this story is that the Buccaneer ended up going to the Gulf, which is a hot country. And I never heard a word about equipment cooling. So it was a success. Would you like one more?
Yeah.
Anybody here flown a Hawk? Goodness me. Anybody who has flown a Hawk knows that if you're not damn careful, you'll burst a tyre on touchdown. It's a very, very well-known problem. And indeed, when I was working at Brough, we used to get one incident report a week, typically, for burst tyres. We discovered, BAE and I, and MOD, discovered that there were two reasons. And the first was the design of the rudder pedals and the brake foot motors was such that if you had a pilot with large feet and was a large person, he could touch the brakes accidentally as he was on the approach. And of course, you need the rudder pedals on the approach more than any other time in flying. The second problem, and the more significant one, was that the T Mark 1 Hawk and T Mark 1A has got an early version of MRAeS braking system. And what we discovered is that the MRAeS braking system, you know, I can see you nodding.
Harrier.
Yes. Didn't work when the wheels weren't going round. The wheels need to be spinning for it to work. And of course, when you touch down an aircraft, the wheels aren't going round. So what we did, we introduced a modification, 1836 I think it was, I've got it there. And a company called ABSE Limited introduced a little black box into the aircraft that delayed the onset of the brakes by 1 second after touchdown. The aircraft will touch down. The weight on wheels, but very carefully, it's not weight on ground, it's rather an unfortunate acronym, if you think about it. The weight on wheels switches would operate, and then 1 second later the brakes would come on, by which time, of course, the wheels were spinning and no problem. Having introduced that modification, we needed to prove it. And that was almost the last job I did. We needed to get the aircraft with the TI on it, trial installation, and ask a test pilot to land the aircraft with his feet on the brakes. Now normally that would be a terrible no-no. And he did it, and nothing happened. So that we knew that it worked. We could then take the TI, approve it by this 555 meeting, and then take the modification formally for classification. So, there we go. Any questions?
Just a quick answer to your comments there about the MRAeS. Exactly the same thing happened on the early Harriers.
Did it?
Yeah, because pilots were nervous. The young pilots had just come over from the Hunter's force into the early Harriers as a Wildenrath, and it was quite common for them to be tense
Yes.
for landing, and the feet were on the brakes, and it was a dual main wheel failure. So
Exactly the same
get the
problem.
tractor out, guys.
Exactly the same problem as we had.
Exactly the same problem.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. I didn't know it happened on the Harrier.
Yeah.
Yeah, interesting point there. They built a lot of the Harrier at Brough,
Yeah.
but the design authority for the Harrier remained at Kingston.
Yeah.
So as RTO, I wasn't involved.
Yeah, I'm only talking about, I don't know, it occurred on subsequent variants of that.
Yes,
But this is GP.
well, indeed, on the T Mark II, they've got a thing called adaptive braking, which solves all those problems. Any others?
Did them, like in the war, the aircraft were modified, like after they came with the production line because there was so much change? Does that still happen with modern aircraft where
Yes.
there's
Yeah.
modifications?
Yeah. The RTO during the war was a very important and very, very busy man. He'd have a big team because even though you're fighting a war, you still need to make sure that your aircraft are airworthy. And that is done by this system that I'm talking about.
Yeah, sorry. As a current BAE employee for at least another month, and involved with the Typhoon and the Hawks, etc., we used to phrase this relationship between the MOD, MAA, Military Aviation Authority these days, and it was if the RAF wanted a dog, they'd buy a cat and modify it. That is still, if I can answer that a little bit, it's still going on today. The Typhoon, the Hawk, the F-35, which is a totally different world. It still happens, and hats off to you, sir, because I know how difficult it is to try and get anything past anybody.
When I worked at Brough, I used to say that the MOD and BAE systems were almost exactly as incompetent as each other.
They'll never find the money to do it right, but they'll find it to do it twice.
Yes. Yes. And I was in the middle, of course.
Yes.
All the time I was in the middle between these two organisations.
Who gets to pay?
Anything else? Yes.
A speaker that we had a couple of years ago said that one of the great strengths of Great Britain in the Second World War was the fact that there were people from the ministry embedded inside the aircraft factories, and the Germans didn't have a similar system.
Yes.
Would you like to comment on that sort of position,
Yes,
and also the overseas systems?
I've heard that said of the war as well, because we had a lecture up at Brough, and that was it. Yeah, my job was I had very much having the ear of the company. I mean, they weren't allowed to be my friends, but if they were, they would have been, because of course we were on either side. There was a great big curtain between us. But I got to know them extremely well when I worked with them. And now I'm retired. Sad to say, I'm closer to people at BAE than I am to my old colleagues in MOD. And I find that rather a shame. But it was because of where I worked. And because I'm now a committee member of the Brough branch of the Royal Aeronautical Society. But yes, I still think that the RTOs did a good job. I mean, these days with electronic systems, and Zoom and Teams and all that sort of stuff, you can argue that you don't need them. But even so, I mean, I had the right to go anywhere I liked in the company. That was one of the rights that I got. And again, it's a sort of right that you use with responsibility. You don't barge in when you're not wanted, where you're not wanted.
Quick one. With the introduction of Fox Hunter radar on the Tornado,
Yeah.
that radar was in development. I think they call it Blue Circle. They had to fit cement blocks and those.
Yes. Blue Circle radar.
Yeah, Blue Circle, yeah. The configuration control was a nightmare because these radars were in development.
Yes.
And as the company was developing the radar, so the model would come in. And I was at Scampton, TRU, and being a representative from CEng, who were taking on the serviceability of these radar, it was, the guys, I must, GC Marconi avionics were magnificent,
Yeah.
but when it came into a service environment, Royal Air Force control, we just couldn't cope.
No.
The service people couldn't cope.
I mean, one thing about the Hawk, it was a clockwork
generated
aircraft.
in
It didn't have electronics in it.
Pardon?
How you control configuration management of software
Yeah.
is an all different subject. And you'll remember how long Typhoon sat on the ground before the first one flew.
No.
And that was because of configuration management of software. Right, anything else, anybody? Yes. Go on.
Yeah, okay.
You've had one before.
Right, me first, yes. Just wondering whether or not, you mentioned the Nimrod very early on there. Do you think that it was a breakdown of the system there that caused the demise of the aircraft? Or was it more than that?
I think the problem is that the MOD, and indeed government, has well, first of all, they don't properly estimate the cost of a thing before they start on it. And secondly, they have grandiose ideas. I mean, HS2, look at it. Costing a fortune. I mean, I can believe that HS2 will be scrapped yet. I hope not. Certainly the northern leg from Nottingham north has gone. And that must have cost a lot of money. I mean, they've got MRA4 flying, and then they scrapped it. And of course, TSR2 is a classic story, isn't it? Yes.
Yes, would the foreign customers, would they generally accept these modifications?
Would they?
Or the Hawks that were sold abroad, would the foreign customers, would they generally accept a lot of these modifications, or is it a different process?
Yes. Yes. I mean, at the LTC meeting that I held, there were representatives. It wasn't just me and the company, it was me and the company and what's called the project office, and the RAF user would be at that meeting. So before it went very far, I got the agreement with all of them that we were doing the right thing. So that when we were taking it forward, I wasn't taking it forward on my own, I was taking it forward with the knowledge that all the players in the game thought it was a good idea. Otherwise we wouldn't have got there in the first place. Methinks you've run out. Thank you very much for inviting. Oh no,
Sorry, I was actually going to answer a bit of the question about the Nimrod actually, and this is personal views, not. But XV230, the Nimrod that crashed in Afghanistan in 6th of September 2007, changed military aviation, or UK military aviation, forever. And a good old Judge Charles Haddon Cave, very good YouTube video if anyone's interested, on the Piper 25 conference, but that's by the way. But what that did on November 2009, he released his report, and on the 1st of April 2010, the Military Aviation Authority was born, with a remit basically to change military aviation regulation, which includes all your design and configuration management, to make it, the only comparison that they had from a risk perspective was civil, so it had to be as civil as possible, military as necessary.
yes.
And with civil aircraft, you've got your design authorities, your type certificate, your continuing airworthiness certificate in there. So the military had to do the same, but with the aircraft that it got on its feet, legacy aircraft, to get a type certificate, or a baseline certificate of airworthiness, you literally got to go back from day one of your design to the present day to identify the modifications, drawings, etc. And some of the older aircraft, you know, the flood of 67 at Brough and the fire at Brough in whatever, a lot of this had disappeared, and that was part of the, really a lot political as well. It was useful, but you know, we lost the Jaguar, the Harrier, the Nimrod, VC-10, TriStars, CEngs, Wessex, and a lot of that was to do that we couldn't prove that configuration management, if you like, from day one, because it was put in a different way.
And that's why Spitfires still aren't flying in the BBMF, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
Classic example. I'm afraid the MOD has become somewhat risk averse.
It is. Yeah.
Does that mean the Spitfires won't fly again?
I have horrible feeling. I mean, Spitfires fly.
But at the Battle of Britain fly?
Yeah, it's the Battle of Britain. Yeah, the Spitfires in the Battle of Britain, of course, are MOD assets. Whereas Spitfire in private hands is authorised by the CAA, not by MOD. They're different animals. You may invite me back and I've got to talk about civil-owned military aircraft. And in that, I talk about this concept of MOD aircraft. Indeed, one of the jobs I used to do was looking after structural integrity, because I was the secretariat for a very important meeting called the Structural Integrity Working Group, which looked after the airworthiness of the aircraft from a structural point of view. And I have since discovered that every aircraft has one of these SIWGs, or SWIG as they get known. There is a Lancaster SIWG. I thought that was quite something. And the Lancasters even got an out of service date. Although of course we all know they'll fly for as long as they'll let it.
Excuse me. Can I just go back to the fork tyres, Thursday?
Yes.
Well, I understood the modification. I'm probably the only one in the room who doesn't know this, but why did nothing happen when you asked the test pilot to land with the brakes on?
Because he was carrying the tile installation for this mod. Can I get the folder out? What's this in here? Like to get things right. It was mod 1863, for anybody that wants to know. I've got minutes of my LTC off my computer at home. And that introduced a little black box into the braking circuit that delayed the onset of the brakes for 1 second. So that when the pilot landed with his feet on the brakes simply didn't come on until the wheels were spinning, at which point the MRAeS system was working and the anti-skid was working, and he could then proceed as normal.
Yeah, I missed that then.
Right. I enjoyed that.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Yes? Thanks, Chris.
Yes, I'm all right.
Nice day standing up and moving. Ladies and gentlemen, I always count it as a privilege to be asked to offer a vote of thanks on behalf of this large and august group that have been sat here for the last hour listening to Jim. This has been an extremely interesting and detailed presentation, Jim, and thank you very much indeed for that. Many of us, in fact there can't be many in the audience that haven't had direct contact with modifications committees and type approvals and Lord knows what else. I'm not quite as familiar with the civil side of changes, but one of the things that did occur to me as we're going through this is how much the modifications are initiated by a commercial drive rather than a technical one. Is that something that you can answer with a
Yes,
with the military?
I touched on it. Everybody would like to make the aeroplane better, but there isn't any money. Because the MOD wastes all the money on things like Nimrod and TSR2 and things like that. The Hawk was a poor relation.
Yeah.
Because it was a training aircraft. Buccaneer and Phantom were better off in those days because there was a defence imperative that they had modifications. But even then, this modification suite, ASR, can't remember the numbers now, that they introduced to upgrade, they wanted to introduce quite a lot of new kit into the Buccaneer, and they couldn't, because they couldn't afford it. It was cut down and cut back and cut back, until pretty well the only thing that they put in the aircraft was an inertial navigation system. They could have put a lot more kit in the aircraft, made it much more capable aircraft.
Yes. I was interested in the kind of commercial drivers because technically building a civilian aircraft isn't anywhere near as complicated as building a fighter. So it kind of begs the question whether or not the changes commercially are initiated because of we want more performance or we want it cheaper, please. Yeah, I know this is the contract we've signed, but I want something different now. Whereas the drivers for military modifications are entirely about performance and hopefully safety.
Yes.
Yeah, you often get into conversations with customers who say, yeah, I know that's what I said 3 years ago.
Yes.
But things have moved on.
Yes.
Yeah, it's an interesting parallel. Thank you very much for a very detailed exposition of a process that, as I say, the vast majority of the audience, I'm sure, has had direct experience of and probably never fully understood.
Yeah.
So thank you very much indeed for the clarification. Ladies and gentlemen.
HDMIs.
Goodbye.
That's it.
This is where we hope now that the next one.